Hi everybody. So some of you might know me. I have been tutoring a whole bundle of you, and the rest of you are all being people who I don't particularly care about. But I'm taking on, from this point onwards, and we're talking about the way that environments influence people and the way that culture is a mediating factor in the way that we interact with the environment. This carries on from many of the themes that Nick just spoke about. But I have to say, my apologies. I am much, much more anthropocentric, so I'm a big fan of human beings and their perspective, and this comes out of my sort of psychological background. So I guess the first thing I want to do is capture your attention, because we're all pretty boring around here, and here's hoping that something a lot more spectacular will do the trick.
A city is a dream of safety made reality. We look at the city and seek more than comfort. We are the lives that refuse to be shaped by this machine.
You stay right here.
We dare to build the future's foundations in the shadows of our past. We move together. We dreamers, awake to the possibilities of our imagination, unbound by these walls.
So that was super dramatic. It's also a fairly interesting representation of the group of people that I did my fieldwork with, who are people who practice Parkour. The thing that ends up being really interesting about them is the way that they use cultural processes to be able to mediate the environmental conditions within which they live. So I'm just going to step ahead forward and introduce you guys to the general theme, which is whenever we do fieldwork within anthropology, we always try to do our best to mediate between three fundamental levels. If you were to join us on the methodologies class, which is coming up in the next semester, you'd find that one of the things that you hear over and over again is that you have to be able to look at everything. It's really, really tempting for us to forget that people exist in different environments. But the reality is people and their environments are almost entirely inseparable. We're always working together. So the thing that I'm going to constantly refer to as the key theme, and all of my students have got this drilled into their head. Painfully, you probably know this as fractal marrying. But the way that I talk about things is the relationship between three central factors. The first one is the human component. The presence of just human beings and the things that we do. I mean, just like any other invertebrate, any other species of animals, any other thing that crawls, walks, or talks, or exists on the face of the planet, we have our own various needs and dispositions. We do, and this is something that anthropology consistently argues with the rest of the philosophical world about, we do have an essential sort of nature. We like to put things in our mouth and poop them out our butts, as a general example, but a whole bunch of other things that just define us as who we are. This is a component that is universal to us. It's one of the things that we can identify through genetic and biological factors and various other ways in which we can tackle things. The second thing that we probably need to consider, I'm going to skip right over and ahead, is the environment within which we exist. Just like every other creature on the planet, at the end of the day, we still need to breathe air, we still need to eat food, and that stuff is something that depends on our environment. You can't just teleport us into the middle of the moon or Mars, even though it would hypothetically solve a whole series of problems. At the end of the day, what's going to happen is we're going to die unless we have the appropriate environmental factors that support us. And this is the kind of stuff that we've spoken about a great deal in this course, the carrying capacity of the place that we live in, species diversity that we are dependent on, the topography, resource presence, all the kind of things that we really essentially need to be able to keep ourselves alive. The thing that I would argue really, really strongly, and this is somewhat tenuous, at the same time has been presented through a whole series of diverse resources, is what we have in between those two is this cultural component. For most of you who've already done this course before, you'll have realized that this is what we talk about when we talk about spiritual ecology. These are the stories that we talk about and tell ourselves that ultimately mediate the way that our eating, pooping human selves will ultimately eat and poop our way through the environment. This is really, really essential to the way that we interact. We, through this course, have seen the way that Western civilizations tend to take a whole bunch of stuff for granted and presumes that we can just eat and poop a whole lot of the way through and we don't have to have too much accountability. And then we have a whole bunch of other cultures that we've seen and spoken about that believe in the notion of a homeostasis. So this idea that we are regulatory in the way that we function, that we owe something to the environment. We can't infinitely take away from whatever resource is available because guess what? We're just a part of a major system. And we're going to be ultimately answerable to the circumstances that we mess up in the process of consuming too much. So this is an important component. So we just saw a kick-ass video of a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of flips. And in the way that I approached the study of this process, which was a 6-year study, I had to consistently refer back to this model and just ask myself, what is the human component in terms of the way that it fulfills various needs that we have? What is the environmental reality in terms of the environment that we live in and the way that it forces us into certain situations? And then what is the cultural narrative? What are the stories that we tell ourselves in order to be able to justify these practices? And that video was amazing because we pretty much captured a great deal of the mythology of the practice of parkour. Quite interesting. I only saw it last night, and when I saw it, I was just like, Jesus, we're going to talk about neurons. It just fits ridiculously well. So that was a nice thing to discover. So what is parkour? At its most fundamental level, when you start off as a noob, the way that I did, it begins as a series of movements. It's a movement problem-solving sort of mechanism, solutions to problems. First thing that you have to learn would be, hey, you know what, I need to lift up my leg. But we don't really talk about that because most of us lift up our legs fairly naturally without too much trouble. The next thing that you need to learn is, well, you know what, I need to lift up my leg to be able to get over a barrier or a wall. Basic mobility issues need to be solved along the way, and then eventually we get to a technique, like a speed vault. And we'd be able to turn around and say, hey, let's learn neurologically the various components and steps to be able to jump over a thing. And so for the beginning, in the beginning of a practice, what you're doing is you're establishing these basic technical skills. And this is really, really important because in order to be able to do a speed vault, you already have to do a whole bunch of background training. A great deal of conditioning, flexibility, mobility is involved in terms of just being able to step over things. So it becomes this like overall big mobility practice. It's a whole deal of fun. This is me, part of the fieldwork process. I got to travel fairly widely, and of course, as anthropologists have to, I had to practice it myself, which is a giant gift. I really enjoyed the shit out of that. So the thing that I did was start off as a complete noob, as somebody who worked in illustration and anthropology, and then sort of work my way all the way through. It's interesting to see the way that you start to internalize various processes and the way that you discover its mythology. Parkour is something that's also really laden with a whole series of stories about why it's worthwhile doing. So it's got a history in which there's a whole bunch of stuff that relates to French nationalism. If you actually do a fair bit of moving through, it was developed within the working class and the sort of lower working class suburbs of Paris. And it was, just in a simple way to put it, an environmental response. You have all of these people who were exceptionally physically capable because many of them were migrants, many of them had parents and relatives who were within movement disciplines, policemen, firemen, military service people, and they were just like, well, there's nothing here except for the really hard, brutalist sort of landscapes within which we live. So they went, hey, you know what, we can appropriate this. That beautiful landscape there was Kiev. I love construction sites. Anybody who does parkour will eventually get to love them. And that's kind of part of the point. It was not nearly as universalist as we like. In case you haven't captured the way that I'm presenting this, by the way, I'm also an illustrator. I did a huge series of comics in the process of doing my thesis, and all of this stuff appeared in my thesis. What we discovered is that parkour doesn't land uniformly everywhere. So once upon a time in the 1990s, a whole bunch of people in the Banyuls, which is the suburbs of France, started jumping around and jumping over things, and then all of a sudden, by the time it's 2001, it's a whole bunch of English-speaking countries. By the time it's 2005, you have the majority of Europe fairly well captivated. By the time it's 2009, you've got James Bond doing it, and Madonna hiring poor people to be part of their performance. By the time that you have it now, if you have access to the internet, there's a pretty good chance that there's a parkour movement there. And this was a major research problem for me. Why is this so successful? I mean, there's a whole bunch of shit that starts off, has a moment in which it sort of peaks, and then it dies. Parkour has been able to grasp itself. It attached itself to a whole series of environments in which it's been really, really useful, and it's just heavily worked. And I mean, this is the interesting part. The point of the slide is, if you go to a place where, for example, sport ideology is the primary way that you want to do things, then competition is a really good part of parkour. People get to interpret it because it's really fresh and really recently related. While as if you go back to France, you'll find that non-competitive value is an essential component. In fact, it's definitional by the people who founded it. David Belle was just like, competition is bad for you because it'll hurt you. But then you have these amazing global fights in which people will just be like, what do you mean competition isn't natural? Competition is just the way the world works. It's dog eat dog. And you have this amazing neoliberal mentality, stuff that we've heard about. And then you have this whole European cooperative kind of notion where it's like, well, actually, the reason why we do this is so we can move together and we don't have to be competitive and we all get to fulfill our ultimate potential. Really, really interesting stuff. So in that same way that ecology is absolutely adaptive, you see these practices that are cultural practices landing on top of existing sort of historical and cultural banks of information and then getting either adapted to them or subverted by them. Traveled in a whole bunch of places. Again, this is the kind of stuff that we want to hear. Ideologies that underpin notions of movement. You go to places like Denmark and people totally get it. You go to places like Australia and you find yourself jumping on a wall and either your neighbour or a policeman will turn around and say, stop doing that, you're about to steal my underwear, potentially steal my TV, all of that kind of stuff. So this is me just kind of rolling through. One of the most interesting components of this practice is the fact that people who practice it almost universally. In fact, this is one of the things that I saw in every single field site that I visited. And I haven't told you guys how many places I've been yet, but it was everywhere in Australia, with the exclusion of Perth. My apologies to Perth. And then Canada, America, Denmark, France, England, Russia, and Ukraine. So I did a pretty extensive series of travels. And one of the things that was completely consistent was this idea that people, wherever I went, turn around and say, my God, I used to be, once upon a time, really crazy, really concerned, really anxious. And then I started parkour and I felt a whole lot better about myself. Either that, or I heard a variant in which people said, I always needed movement. And then I heard this philosophy and it articulated to me what I've always done. It made it okay for me to do the thing that I was seeking to do. This is a really central component. So, the other thing that I would have to say, the limitation of my study, because if we're a good scientist, we have to always point out our own limitations, is I spent most of my time within cities. Largely because of logistical restrictions, the university very kindly bought me around the world plane ticket, and I couldn't exactly justify traveling out to the middle of nowhere on the basis of the fact that I only had a month to 3 weeks at every single location, which was still a huge amount of travel, kind of exhausting, but also kind of fun. This is what we're actually going to be talking about. There's a reality, and if all of you good people have been reading your readings, and I'm presuming that you have, and all the students who aren't here right now, I'm aware that you're terrible human beings. But if you've all been doing all of your readings, you're doing the kind of work that has already given you some level of insight on the notion of human niche transformation. We're going back to the classic little three-pronged idea, fractal mirror for everybody who knows it. Human beings interact with their environment and tell themselves stories about it. And the city is unquestionably one of the biggest environmental transformations that we could conceivably imagine. The last series of information, which has been broadcast across every potential news media that you could imagine, has told us that currently 55% of the population is already living in an urbanized environment. 55%, that's over half. And this is outdated data, so we'd be pushing 60 easily by now. And it's going to be 2/3 by 2015. And you know what? I think that their metrics are actually a little bit slow. I think it's going to be faster than that. One of the interesting things that we've been seeing throughout this course is that urbanized population living is something that forces itself on people. Cities create all kinds of sub-niches and needs. What we have is, guess what? If you live in a city, you can't go out and just scare the wild possums. You can't go out and just shoot a kangaroo for dinner. Well, you might be able to, but you might get arrested. What happens is you have to go out to the supermarket and buy massively produced consumer goods, which require transportation, which require packaging and all kinds of classical support, which is the kind of stuff that fucks up life for the largely indigenous populations. How we see plastics introduced to the atmosphere, how we see fuel being used. We go back to Nick's video about the people who are living up in the northern hemisphere and say, hey, we can't really sustain our lifestyles. And this is something that we can relate to also recently in a political sense, when we've had political leaders turn around and say, those indigenous people living up in the north end are just so annoying, and I wish that they would just stop, and they're being selfish by living the lives that they live in. What's the solution to that problem? Join the urbanized landscape. And that's exactly the cause of the problem. It's a beautiful system. It sort of grows on itself perpetually. So if you were to read Greg Downey's paper, what we see is a couple of central ideas, and that is human beings evolve within the environmental framework within which they live. The city itself is an environmental niche. This is something that's a really big deal. You are different in a whole series of ways due to the fact that you exist within that city landscape. So the other thing about that is, so the city is an environmental framework. The city is its own niche. If you've ever learned anything about evolution, you'll know that the process of adaptation is all about species figuring out ways in which they don't die. It's not a matter of them being really good at things, it's a matter of not dying within niches. And guess what? Our environment, city environments, are niches within which we just don't need to die. That's the only thing we need to do to carry on our genes. Just don't die. And immediately, the Darwinian factor is kicked in. So a city is a niche with its own niches. If you are the Kardashians or Donald Trump, you're probably not concerned about food, even though your stresses are through the roof because you're concerned about social media and a whole bunch of other stuff, but that's another lecture and we won't talk about that in particular. But your life is completely different to somebody who has got to wake up in the morning on the side of the curb, figure out a way in which they can have their food, figure out a way in which they can make it through the day. So the city is as complicated in some ways as a lot of forest environments. You have people who need to fit into various niches within the urban niche. So we do have very notably, and this is still actually fairly early as an argument, Darwinian impacts on the way that this behaves. And this is the paper that you guys were set by Downey, in which he talks about the potential roots of this process. So in other words, what are Darwinian impacts? It only matters, Darwin doesn't give a shit about the stuff that you like, he doesn't care about what your favorite color is. What he cares about is whether or not the stuff that you do gets you to have sex and pass on your offspring. That's the only thing Darwin gives a crap about. Doesn't matter how pretty you are, or kind you are, or anything else, everything becomes a strategy via which you can reproduce. So when we talk about classic Darwinian sort of ecological, genealogical reproduction, what we're talking about is whether or not people survive or people die. Like I said, just don't die, and you'll be okay in terms of passing on your genes. So some of the stuff that we see mentioned within the Downey article, he talks about three really, really basic sort of things that are definitely present within our urban environments. He talks about, and I'm not going to talk about the street kids, because they are niche within niche, and I'll leave it up to you guys to read that. But the three things that he talks about is metabolic issues in the cityscape, in other words, the foods that we eat and the way that they impact us. And it's interesting to see because within the lower niches we can't afford to all be paleo or organic or whatever else, we just eat McDonald's or whatever cheapest crap we can get our hands on. So we have this amazing balance between malnutrition and obesity. It's definitely a phenotypic thing that gets passed on. The other thing that he talks about is bone density, and that relates to physical activity. Because if you are anything like me, ever since I stopped doing my parkour fieldwork, I'm sitting in the office for most of the day writing things that I can talk to you about right now, or you guys are writing papers that I can sit in the office and read, and therefore we mutually kill each other through inactivity and reduce each other's bone density. Thanks a lot. And the other thing that we talk about, and this is actually the focus of my talk because I'm a neuroanthropologist, is mental health, and the way that hypersociability is something that is a feature of the city landscape that really messes us up in a whole bunch of serious ways. Beautifully and importantly, also enriches our lives in a whole series of ways, but I want to do the doom and gloom part first because it's the best way to do these kind of things. And the thing that's really important to us is that culture is a two-way street. Culture's interaction with nature and nature's interaction with us, and all of the various biofeedback components, you can't change that whole three thing where you have the person, the culture, and the environment. You change one, it's going to impact the others. So this is classic stuff. Colonialism came along, drastically transformed cultural expectations, and you have a whole bunch of other knock-on effects. All those three components are inherently related. And we're going to see a lot more about that. We adapt to the environment, but at the same time we do this crazy thing with our frontal cortex where we imagine the way that we want our environment to be, and then we adapt it to us. Two-way street. So, what we're going to talk about is parkour in the city. We're going to talk about the three-factor application. Right there, you probably have everything that you need if you wanted to do a really simplistic analysis of what parkour is. Because you just turn around and say, geez, these guys are all like jumping around, and they're probably eating better because they need to jump around, and they're like more engaged with their environment because they're jumping on it, and therefore, that's it, that's all you need. Parkour is an adaptation strategy because it makes your metabolism better, it makes your bone density higher, and it probably has benefits to your mental health. Thing is, we have to be scientific about it, and I had to write 80,000 words, so that wasn't nearly enough for me to do it, and I went to a whole bunch of places, so let's get more complicated than that. In order to do that, I'm going to have to take you through some basic neuro stuff. Now, don't be scared. You don't actually have to know any of this. I'm just going to run through some basic stuff that is going to prove things together. You don't have to remember any names. So we're going to talk about a thing called the limbic system. The limbic system is something in your brain that just receives all the signals. Again, don't be scared. I'm not actually going to get boring and going on too much about this kind of stuff. But there is 4 components of the limbic system, which is like the basic cortical thing underneath our brain, that are really, really important to us. Because what they do is they turn around and they say to us, oh, you can feel this, you can see that, and you can do whatever else. And there's a beautiful book called Descartes' Error, which points out that if you are in any way a decent scientist, you don't believe in the idea that you're completely rational. All of you are batshit crazy. Congratulations. Every single one. The thing about it is, it's not a matter of thinking. Before you even think, this system kicks in and makes you panic, or makes you concerned, or gives you the general heebie-jeebies. And then your thinking will, for that point onwards, be tainted by these particular feelings. The 4 things that I want to talk about are these bits and pieces, and for anybody who's a neuroanthropology or a neurologist colleague, they're going to hate me because I picked this picture because it's pretty. This is definitely form way over function. So we have a thalamus, which is not even present in this drawing, which is a 2 cortical structure right in the center where we found it. What it does is it collects all the information that is sensory. It just makes you feel things. It's like the first point of call. Whenever you touch something or hear something or see something, it's where the information goes in. Then you have a hippocampus, which sort of is wrapped around it. And what it does is, if that signal is deemed to be important enough, it'll just commit things to your memory. It'll make you remember things. It's a pretty nice, useful feature to have, especially when you are dealing with immediate stimuli. Then you have the hypothalamus, which is a tiny little dangly thing, which is like the big transmitter signal. It sends messages to the rest of your body, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And you have the amygdala, which has a really bad reputation. A lot of people think that it's like the reptilian brain, and it makes you bite people on the face. It's really not. What it does is it controls the level at which you feel things. That's what it does. It just says, do you love this person? Well, if the amygdala kicks in, well, you love them a whole lot more. And do you hate this person? If the amygdala kicks in, you hate them a whole lot more. It's a two-way street, and it's something that's regularly underlined. I think poor Descartes really gets a really bad rap, because Descartes was around in the 1600s, and he was a Christian, and he just liked to sleep in until like 2 to 3 in the afternoon. He's a pretty interesting character. Everybody always blames everything on Descartes. But, I mean, we can go back and we can talk about the way that we've always assumed that we've got separations between our higher consciousness and our emotion states, all the way back to Plato. Descartes has just been following his ideas. He was just in with the wrong crowd. It was only a couple of thousand years later, but at the same time, he always cops the blame. So I just wanted to immediately point out, let's not be too mean to Descartes. We're moving on. So as long as we have this basic idea, this is why you don't have to be freaked out. Your senses imprint on your memory, which then will let you know how strongly you'll react, which will then pass on signals to the rest of your body. That's all that slide is about. See, there you go, you're all professional neuroscientists now. The other thing that's really important is when you get past that system, and I'm sorry, this is not particularly flattering, but all of you are just like giant water balloons. You are all filled with water, fat, bones, and the rest of it. That's all you are. And if that system decides to communicate a big, broad message, and this is just the best way that I could describe it, here you are in your best of state, you look fabulous. And then what we have is we've got a pipette dripping some colouring into a sack of water, and then the whole sack is covered. I've just explained endocrine systems to you completely. You are saturated with hormones. This is how it works. Your brain speaks to your hypothalamus, which then talks to your pituitary gland, which then releases a whole series of hormones, which we can just describe as dye, which then colour you completely. And they die after a while, they decompose. So if you just are stressed for a little while, after a while they just don't matter anymore. But that's a whole different thing. Now, the other thing that I need to introduce as part of your introductory biological lectures, I bet you guys as anthropologists didn't expect to get this much biology. The other thing that I introduce is the idea of autoregulation. So, if you just keep dripping dye, and you're just perpetually that fat blue person over there, your organs just get bored of the shit. We literally have this whole thing. The reason why the dye matters is because various bits and pieces of us have receptors that the dye grabs. And if you are just constantly feeling a signal or a stimuli, those receptors just stop being produced. We reduce the number of them so that we don't react as strongly. It's volume control. If you have somebody yelling at you constantly, after a while you're just going to be like, oh, just fucking shut up, I'm not listening to you anymore. And that's the basis of autoregulation. So if you have constant stimuli, your body will just make you less receptive to that stimuli. All of this will come in handy in a bit. Genes! Don't worry, it's not nearly as complicated as it might look. This is Wikipedia, they do a fantastic job. Scary thing about that is if you are a water balloon filled with dye, everything is saturated because hormones come in two types, hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Doesn't matter, you don't need to write that down. In other words, one or the other one will proliferate every component of who you are. They go through all the cells, they get all the way through, and they stick to your DNA. And that's the weird and cool thing about that, because after a while, what happens is that your DNA decides which bits of it it wants to ignore. Now, the big thing about DNA is that is completely unalterable. The best way to describe that is that it is the complete transcript of every version of you that could exist. The fattest version of you, the thinnest version of you, the most beautiful version of you, the richest versions of you, the poorest of you, it's all there. And the way that it reacts to things is that it's got this amazing sheath called chromatin, and it just decides, well, you're poor now, so I'm just going to close off the fabulous component and make you all ugly and bitter and annoyed about the world. Similarly, if you're really, really rich, it's going to close off those components, and it literally changes the way that we then produce cells. So that's why when you have twin studies, you have one really rich twin who goes, it's twins. Have you guys seen Twins with Arnold Schwarzenegger? It's how you make Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's how it works. If it was real life, this is how it'd be, because the chromatin would contain both of them, and then one just got really messed up by life and became Danny DeVito, and the other one grew up in a beautiful island and became Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's a pretty good way to talk about it. So, crazy kind of stuff. There's a paper that I referenced there talking to, and this is just an essential one because there's a million of them, talking about the way that chromatin, which is, chromatin is just a sheet, it just covers your DNA. Because DNA is floppy, like a piece of paper. Chromatin contains it in a sheath and gives it structure, and then it decides which point of the paper various bits that need to read things need to read. It's like a little slidey codey thing, and it's useful. Does this make sense? You just learned everything about epigenetics that you'll ever need. You're both neurologists and epigeneticists. It's amazing. Fantastic. Guess what? Horrible news. Anthropology, that's where we are. We don't deal with happy things. What's really interesting about this is it's got Darwinian knock-on effects. We used to think that was just a reactionary thing. We used to turn around and we used to talk about ideas like, alright, so chromatin and genetic adaptation is just limited to a single generation. What we know from studying horrible things that happen to people who had nothing to do with them is that that's not the case at all. So what we see happening within people who survived the Tutsi genocide, within the Tutsi-Hutu conflict in Central Africa, thanks Danish colonialism for that one, by the way, if anybody's interested. What we have there is that we have hereditary PTSD. So the sheath in their DNA, good old chromatin, has made them much more susceptible to stress. From that point onwards, even if the kids of the people who were born at that point didn't have that much choice about the way that they reacted, whenever stress came along, their DNA had programmed the various components of their brain that we talked about earlier to be super reactive to that stress. And you know what? It's really trying to help us out. Because that's the way that we adapt to circumstance. Our body is going, holy crap, even before we were born, what we're seeing within the DNA coding is this person has seen trauma and stress that you would not believe. So when the kid is born, make them super alert. The joke version of this is why are chickens so twitchy? Because we eat 100% of them. They have good reason to be terrified. And it applies to human beings. If your parents have gone through horrible trauma, you're going to be naturally reactive towards stress stimuli, which is all kinds of problematic because it means that you're just going to be really anxious all the time. And you're examining symptoms of PTSD even before you've had a traumatic experience. We're going to steal another study from a biological perspective. Accommodation to multiple environmental influences of distinct and potentially redundant sites or genes is central to stress regulation and would facilitate maximum stress responsibility adaptation. That's a fancy pants word version of the way that basically it's useful for you. What I'm saying is, that's a paper that was also done really recently on survivors of Holocaust victims. That's 2 generations down the line, and they're still seeing PTSD symptoms imprinted within their genetic frequency, within the chromatin structures. Remember, your genes don't change, the way your genes express themselves change. So that's really uplifting. In terms of this particular component, here is what I really want you to take away. Your sensory experience of your environment completely defines your stress response. So how you see things and then how you interpret things really is the thing that defines the way that you experience it, whether or not it passes on. And this is a really big deal because the way you see things and the way you interpret things are 2 different things. We'll get onto that in a second. Second thing is, long-term stress triggers epigenetic change that influences your mental states and your resilience. And it's an adaptive response. It's not like your genes are just mean to you. They're trying to help you out. So, we're talking about cities and changing our environments, and now we're seeing a bit of an interesting pattern coming out. That's the way that we're talking about it. So number 3, these changes are carried on from generation to generation, but are open to environmental retuning. You take that child from that awful genocide, and then you just be really, really nice to them. And you know what? They deregulate. Chromatin structures realign. You can fix things. It might take a while, it might even take a generation, but you can repair that reaction because it's reactive both ways. It's not just reactive to stress, it's reactive to absence of stress. And now we have abstract stresses in the city. We're moving on to the city, by the way. So that was us entirely talking about the first bit, which is people. This is biological stuff that people live in. But remember, it's people, environment, and culture. Those are the three things that we're looking at. So the next one, city. You're all stressed out. Really, really crazy stressed out. The thing about it is city environments are, and there's so many studies, it's ridiculous confirming this, really high in stimulation. Doesn't matter where you go, guess what? Most people who lived probably about 400 years ago only saw about 300 to 500 people in their entire lifetime. We see that when we walk down the street. That's a lot of stimulation that we're dealing with. And then every time you turn on Facebook, you're just seeing like all of this crap that's going on, and that's exhausting, and you're comparing yourself unconsciously to them, and then you have to worry about your job and the money that you have in your bank account. And the interesting thing about this is that we have this amazing brain that doesn't distinguish between us being scared of being eaten alive by a lion and us being scared of just long-term terrified notion of not being able to pay the rent. This is a really big problem. It's a big problem in terms of mental health. Because what happens is we are living in these environments that are filled with people and we're feeling socially isolated. And at the entire time, we're just stimulated to this exceptional level. And do we remember the whole notion of adaptation? The whole thing about if you turn up the volume, your receptors will turn down, happening to us on a regular basis. We just get really freaked out about this kind of stuff. Pavlotski's wonderful book, and every other book that he's written about it is pretty much on this topic. Wonderful stuff to look at. In the meantime, cities produce this environment that is a combination of social isolation and social stimulation. And you have these amazing studies in which you take a whole bunch of people from the country and you put them in an MRI machine, and you take a whole bunch of people from the city and you put them in an MRI machine and you say, solve a basic math problem, and then you give them a time limit, and the people who live in the city freak out because we're so used to time limits and the way that we interact. We've been trained into it. Whether or not it's genetically or neurologically, it doesn't matter. We freak out on a regular basis. Cities train us to behave in this particular way. And then the interesting thing about that is when we have these discussions, we can't tell whether or not they're genetic or neural. Because guess what? Our genes show that stress. Again, these two studies are the two that I found that were fairly early. Actually, they're the later ones because I wanted them to be current. But having said that, there are a whole series of studies that follow that up that say, hey, you know what? The city makes you freaked out. It's almost as bad as being in a genocide. Now, for all of you people who hate cities, you're all just like, I knew it, but it's really much more complicated than that. Because, and I'm just going to quickly run through this, what happens to all these wonderful organs is then your hippocampus gets smaller, which is the bit that reprints memory, gets less dense. You start to forget things and not focus so well. That's why you all have short attention spans. I've been telling you this the entire time because you're shrinking your hippocampus, you hipster city-dwelling doofuses. And the other thing about it is your amygdala gets huge. So the regulation of emotion is up and down. It's all over the place. It really adapts. This is your genes telling you that this is the environment that you live in. Exciting kind of stuff. Guess what? I didn't find that much of that with parkour people. I heard a lot of field stories where people were telling me those are the symptoms that they encountered before they started. And you know what? That varied in accordance to the way that the spectrum functions. Some people were really competitive, and I noticed they were slightly stressed out. But hey, I didn't have a brain scanner on me. That's the thing that I need to get. By the way, find your bodies. This is my application for my next grant. Versus the people who thought about notions of parkour as being something that's non-competitive, altruistic, community-oriented. They seemed fairly chill, but then again, most of them are freaks too. So you need to scan all their brains to be able to make a kind of scientific conclusion about that. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, Not everybody deals with stress the same way. If cities were just universally bad for us, then all of us would be dead by now, and cities would just be gone because we can't handle them and we couldn't adapt. It's interesting to hear, this is where we reintroduce the cultural component. This is the moment at which the narrative changes, much like with the stuff that Nick was talking about and the way that we reinterpret our national environments and stuff to give them all kinds of value in terms of the narratives that we produce. We can also do the same thing with the stimulus that we experience as part of everyday city living. And this is pretty exciting. I'm going to skip a fair bit of it. I mean, obviously when all of us die, what are the situations that help us deal with that kind of stimulus? All of us will be obviously stressed out if we set our feet on fire, or if we get, I don't know, stabbed in the head by a duck or a possum or something. That's going to cause us stress, and that's no way that we can talk ourselves out of that. But if we can return our level of stimulus, if we can change that fat balloon version of ourselves back to normal, we've got the word for this. If we can return to homeostasis, then we don't suffer the long-term genetic effects. And there's a whole series of ways in which that functions. So Robert Sapolsky once again talks about 6 essential components that allow us to deal with these stress environments. So one of them is an outlet. If you have a younger brother or a sister, you're probably going to be okay because you probably spent your entire adolescence being mean to them. And that's fucked them up, but it's made you deal with it much better, and so congratulations. You've probably not messed yourself up nearly as badly. Second thing is a hobby, an activity that entirely encapsulates your attention. If you are really freaked out and you can go back and you can play the piano or, I don't know, paint your Warhammer figure, or watch anime or whatever, that's fine. Doesn't make any difference. What happens is that it just deregulates. It returns you to homeostasis. The other thing about it is predictive information. So do you know how long this awful life is going to last? Am I going to be better about it? Is there things that indicate to me that things are going to get better? Oh, I'm making more money now. Am I getting a promotion? All of that kind of stuff makes us feel a little bit better about our existence. A general illusion, and I love this, an illusion of control. It doesn't matter if it's real. If you pray to the Grand Poobah with the antlers and you believe that he's going to help you, then that's all you need. It's fine, doesn't matter if he doesn't exist. Santa Claus, if you believe in him and you think a good present is coming, you'll be fine. It'll be terrific for you. Just believe. This is the importance of it. Just believe. An expectation of an end. So when you can see the end come, you just go, not in the morbid, we're all going to die sense. In a, okay, well, geez, this awfulness is only going to last 2 weeks and then I'm going to be okay. But that helps us because we focus on the future and we can reduce our stimulus by imagining a better life. And then social network. Your friends are so good for you. Just having somebody to bitch to really makes all the difference. All you have to do is come around and just talk to them, and then it just re-regulates your functions and the way that it functions. And so I'm thinking about all this stuff. How are we doing for today?
About 4-2.
So I had an anecdote, but I'm going to skip it. So I was looking into the ways that Parkour might specifically fit into a variety of this stuff. And I looked into the psychology and neurology of the way that things function. And I found very, very quickly, and this is actually really related to that spiritual ecology notion that we studied earlier, is that spirituality is defined by psychologists in a really interesting way. It's not about having crystals or slapping yourself with fish or whatever else. It's about... and just a great quote, spirituality, the belief in a meaningful life imbued in a sense of connection with a higher power, the world, or both. It's simply a matter of connecting yourself with context. Isn't that interesting? And then a whole bunch of interesting studies, and there's like hundreds of them, but I picked some of my favorites. So cortical thickness, the amount of density in your brain increases if you think that religion is important, even if you don't go to church that often. Inversely, it decreases if you have a spiritual awakening, which is really freaking hilarious. So if you're born again, there's a chance that your brain's a bit thin, but if you've just been consistently doing it, it's okay. That's got to do with class and trauma, but I just thought it was really fun. Biofeedback and meditative practice make your hippocampus really dense, and they reduce the impact of aging. So that's hippocampus, if you guys remember, it's the bit that helps you form memories. So if you learn to meditate or just go, I can control my breathing, it's amazing because we always think about, this is why Descartes was wrong, we always think it's the brain controlling the body, but if we just chill our body out, then our brain gets better, and it's amazing, amazing sort of feedback. And then we had a study of, a huge longitudinal study that was cross-cultural, that said that altruism, with the components, love, interconnectedness, and altruism were associated with less selective psychopathology in all countries. And this is 5 countries that are vastly and disparately different from each other. A self-reported study that combines medical information with spiritual practice. So I was like, oh, that's really cool. Well, that explains parkour in a whole bunch of interesting ways. So parkour is a cultural construction. It's something that we came up with. Why is it that it was able to spread so effectively? Why is it that it spread so much quicker than everything else? If we thought about it back to simple like bone density and morbidity and all that other stuff, then it could just be any sport. But this one stuck in a way that a whole bunch of other physical activities did not. Why? Because it's specific. It connects us to the city. It connects us to the environment. The mythology of parkour, the cultural component, says this: the city is not your enemy anymore. And this is a really, really big deal. Because we turn around, walking around, with that classical sort of, all of you hippies, greenies that are taking this course, you're all just like, the city is awful for you, and the forest is where you go to recover. Well, parkour says to you, you know what? No, it isn't. The city is a place where you can activate your social networks, where you can connect to people, where you can have a hobby, where you can deal with your various physical issues, where you can deal with all these other issues that are actually the product of the city itself. The thing that makes it really, really effective is the fact that it's a solution. It's a cultural adaptation to a city environment. And I guess that takes us back all the way to the beginning. We are constantly going through this process where we have people in the environment, and then we have the cultural component that connects all of them. And we've heard from Nick just a little bit earlier about the way that national systems and ecology and preservation is very, very carefully culturally articulated to justify the systems that were introduced and imposed upon others. What we have here is an example of adaptation. Parkour is really recent, and the reason why it's successful is because it's able to solve a whole lot of these problems for us, not physically, but conceptually. And that actually has knock-on effects. So, I guess that's the end of our thing, and we're out of time. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.